let's take a closer look at our stitches and see if we can get a better understanding of how our stitches are constructed. I'm going to take this sample here of double crochet stitches just to start off with. So we consider this whole from top to bottom a stitch. And a lot of times you can even count using that whole section there. Many people look at the top of the stitch. So the tops of your stitches, in this case double crochet, is anytime you can see those V's being formed there. Okay, so in a double crochet it looks like that. This is a half double crochet swatch, just a little shorter than the double crochet, but you see how the top looks exactly the same with those V's. This is a sample of single crochets, much shorter stitch. Again, you can see the V's at the top here. Okay, so let's go back to our good old double crochet stitch. So we have the height of the stitch here. So at the top, we have the loops. So the top of the stitch is the loop section of this stitch. And many times, so you'll be working into the top of that stitch there, those top two loops. So you'll see that being formed. So a lot of times when you're doing double crochets, you'll work into those two stitches. Actually, let me just do that right now. So the bottom here, this is the base of that. So when we go into the next stitch, we usually go directly into the whole top of the stitch. So see that there? There's two loops, okay? And then you just work your stitch as usual. Whoops. Oh, let me do that again. Sometimes this yarn gets away from me. So you work your stitch as usual. So see how that creates a little bit of a gap there. So you can see, it's very identifiable, very easy to see. So these loops form the top of your stitch. In some patterns, you will hear people discuss the front loop and the back loop, because some stitches will ask you, some patterns will ask you to work into the back loops only. And that means instead of going underneath through the whole thing, they're asking you to go into the back loop. What is the back loop? It's always the loop that's facing away from you, that's furthest away from you. So this loop here would be the front loop. So why would somebody ask you to do that? It's just to create a different effect. So for example, if I'm going to do a double crochet here into the back loop only, I will go in through the top here and do my double crochet, and you'll see the loop starts to stretch up a little bit, but don't panic. I'm going to do a couple of these so you can see the effect. So into the back loop only. So what happens is, after you've done this for a while, it starts to actually push this front loop forward, and it creates a bit of a ridge. So you see how here there's no ridge? Actually, let me do a couple more into the regular stitch so that you can really see the main difference. So I'll do a couple more here. These are all double crochet stitches going into the full stitch. So here we go. So see the effect? These three were done in the back loops, which pushes these forward loops forward, creating a nice little ridge here. When I go into the full stitch, it tends to blend right in there. And it's a neat thing to kind of do if you're working on cuffs of hats or mitts or even sweaters, or just to kind of create a neat little design. So that's what they mean when they say work into the back loops. There are some times when they will ask you to work into the front loops, which does the opposite. So if you work into the front loop here, it just pushes these back loops out, creating a ridge on the other side. So if you hear them, just if you see any patterns that talk about working into loops, they're always talking about the top of your stitch here. Okay, so which reminds me, we call these V's the stitches. This is how normally we would count the stitches. But when we look at this, we go, oh, okay, that's a double crochet stitch. This is a half double crochet stitch, etc., etc. However, if you look at a project like this that has these clusters, which we call granny shell stitches, so these consist of, sorry for the dark yarn here, guys, these consist of 3 double crochets worked into one stitch. This cluster here is known as a granny shell stitch, which really it's more of a stitch pattern per se. Whereas, yeah, many people would call this whole scarf a particular pattern or a pattern sequence, we could call it. But so sometimes don't get confused, because some people will just call this a stitch, which is kind of right? So this is the granny shell stitch, but the stitch consists of 3 double crochet stitches within it. So in this particular row, for example, I have 12 granny shell stitches. But if I'm counting the number of stitches in my row, I know I have 36, because there's 3 stitches within each granny shell design, we'll say. So I know it sounds like a lot of double talk, but you'll kind of get used to the lingo and be able to figure it out as you go. So that's what we mean when we talk about the stitch itself. But almost always when you're counting your stitches, you want to count from the top loops here that create these V's. You will also hear the term bottom loops. So you've got in this example, this is a half double crochet sample. So you'll find that you have the front loops and the back loops. Okay, so when you're working your stitches, when you turn it over, you'll hear that some patterns will call for working into the bottom loops. So the bottom loops, in this case, is a half double crochet sample. So here you have your front loop, your back loop, and now if I turn it this way, I have a bottom loop right there. Okay, so this is the front loop, which is at the top, and the bottom loop is right here. So this is another common way to work into a stitch, is working into the bottom loop. So for example, if we're going to, this is a half double crochet. So if we're going to work into the bottom loop, I am going to identify my top first of all. So I know that's the top of my stitch. I just turn it forward this way, and I can find my bottom loop there. Okay, so I would work my way into there. This is another way of creating a ridge, pushing out certain stitches forward. In the particular case of like a half double crochet and even a double crochet, not as much for a single crochet because it's a much shorter stitch. But what this does is when it pushes the tops forward, it actually creates a ridge that looks a bit like a knit stitch. So I'm just doing a few of these here into the bottom loops. Okay. And so when I turn over my work, see that? Not only does it create a ridge, but I've got this cute little kind of braided knit effect, and it looks super, super cool. So if you wanted to create a little design, maybe a scarf or something, create a ridge, this is a really nice way to work it in. Okay, so that is working into the bottom loops. Another thing you'll hear a lot, mostly worked, not all the time, but mostly worked with double crochet type stitches, is posts, working into the front and the back of the posts. So I like using a double crochet in this example because it's a taller stitch. So the post is the length of this stitch here. So that's considered the post. So in total, you've got a full stitch here. You've got the tops, which are the 2 loops. Okay, so this is the top of the stitches here. You've got a back loop and you've got a front loop. You've also got a bottom loop right there. If I can, whoop. You've also got the bottom loop right there. And you also have a post. See that? That's the post of this stitch. So, and in future patterns, we'll talk about this as well when we create other pieces of work. But so when you hear them talk about working into a front post, for example, if you're doing a front post double crochet, they're talking about actually weaving your hook in behind so that it pushes this post to the front. When they talk about the back post, they're talking about weaving from behind your hook, obstructing that post, so it pushes your post to the back. And again, we'll get into patterns that will deal with front and back post double crochets, but this tutorial is more about understanding how your stitches are constructed and what the terms are and things that you'll hear now and again. In this in this half double crochet swatch, you will also hear people talk about front and back posts. Now, it's a shorter stitch, it's a fatter stitch, but you can still find the post, and what you would do is you just kind of stretch it out. So see, you can see there's a post. It's a little bit of a shorter one, but if I insert my hook here and I weave it in behind, there you go. You can see that post in the half double crochet. And again, these types of stitches are designed to create ridges and designs of different kinds. In the single crochet, if you pull it apart, I mean, it's there. You see how short and stubby that post is? It is there, but you don't hear patterns using it as much in the single crochet stitch, but that is it right there. So the post, okay? So again, back to our double crochet, the post is right there. So for the most part, those are all the main terms of the stitch. Those are all the main little parts of the stitch that you're going to hear a lot about over and over again. So this, again, I know I'm being repetitive, but I like to make sure that it all makes sense to you. So this is the full stitch. If you look at the top, your V's, these are the loops. Okay? So you've got the front loop and the back loop. And usually you would go in, that's the full stitch. And then these are the separate loops, front and back. You also have a bottom loop, which is just underneath there. And then lastly, you want to understand that this height here, that's a post. Like that. Okay? Hopefully you have found this very helpful. And if you have any questions, leave me a comment below. I'd be happy to help. So make sure to click subscribe for future crochet tutorials, and if you're like to check out some of our stitch session conversations, and we will see you next time. Take care.